What's up, heathens? How ya doing? I am the Godless engineer, and I critically analyze apologist claims to give you the best arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. Today, we're going to be taking a look at somebody that I haven't really looked at in a long time. He's pretty famous here on YouTube. He's responded to me a few times, and they've been mostly unproductive. But today, we're going to be talking to this asshole.
Hey, everybody. Check out this jacket I have. It's pretty cool. It looks like a cross right here. It's called Hawk, H-W-K. We are going to be doing a video today on 14 reasons why I'm a Christian. And you're going to find that they're all excellent reasons. And I'm also going to talk about why I left atheism.
All right, shock of God, let's hop on that motorcycle. At least this time you didn't start with your whole evolution motorcycle sort of intro thingy. I'm really glad that you're kind of breaking away from that dumb shit that you normally say. But today we're going to be going over, well, not 14, but 5 reasons why Shock of God left atheism and is a Christian, and why you should be too. So, if you want to see Shock of God fail yet again, then please stay tuned. Whew, all right, Shock of God, what do we have today?
So, let's get going. And we're going to do it on this motorcycle here. We're going to be starting the motorcycle here. And look at how complex this motorcycle is. Do you know that you, the viewer, are over 1 million times more complex than this motorcycle? Let's start it up. I've never seen anything complex that wasn't the product of intelligence. Intelligence had to create it. I can't even see or find one thing that is complex that intelligence was not responsible for it. Obviously, this didn't evolve over time on its own. Intelligence created this. You, the viewer, are well over 1 million times more intelligent, and the product of intelligence designed with your respiratory system, your eyes, your inner skeleton. You guys ready to do this?
Ah, Jesus fuck. He just couldn't get away from saying that his fucking motorcycle didn't evolve over time. He fails to understand that motorcycles don't have a natural process for them to like come together or to change over time naturally through genetic mutations. He doesn't understand the difference between designed motor vehicles and motorcycles and just nature. So, yes, while we are very complex, we also don't necessarily need a skeleton. There are plenty of organisms out there that don't have a skeletal system. But just because we're complex and we have a lot of systems that work along with each other does not mean that we had to be intelligently designed. We actually have a clear map going backwards in time that shows how we evolved out of a single-celled organism at the beginning of life. So, Shock of God fails yet again to understand even the basics of evolution.
So let's start off with number 1 because we have a lot to accomplish. We're going to go through 14 reasons why I'm a Christian. And if you're a Christian and your friends ask you why you're a Christian, these are great reasons. They're all rational reasons. Some of them scientific, some of them philosophical, some of them historical, and some of them spiritual.
All right, guys, so remember, these are the best reasons why you should definitely be a Christian. And they're scientific, they're philosophical. I mean, he's got evidence coming out of every freaking orifice that he has. Although I feel like this is just going to be the same shit that he's pulling out of the same hole every single time.
Let's start off with my challenge. I've been challenging atheists for years to conquer the Shock of God challenge. What proof and evidence can you provide that will finally at last prove that atheism is accurate and correct? No atheist has been able to accomplish answering it or conquer it, making it the longest running challenge on YouTube in YouTube history. It'll be 11 years next month.
Yeah, but you see, the problem with your whole challenge thing is that nobody has asserted this, or those that have asserted it have actually responded to you, but you just simply refuse to accept their answer. You say that they're not right in favor of your particular understanding of your faith or your worldview. So I'm not the one making the claim that atheism is accurate and correct. Like I said, there could be people out there that do this. I am not one of them. So I have yet to fail this particular challenge because I've not taken it up. Atheism never asserts that it is accurate or correct. It just simply describes whether or not a person believes in a God. I don't have to prove shit to you. In fact, you are the one that has to prove shit to us. So the actual longest running challenge has been for Christians to prove that their faith is accurate and correct.
So let's start off with number one. The people that lived with Jesus Christ and witnessed Jesus Christ, they all admitted that they saw appearances of Jesus Christ.
Okay, this is a pretty good start. Who are you saying were eyewitnesses of Jesus Christ? I would love to know these names. If I had my shirt right now, it would say citation fucking needed, but it's coming in the mail. I still need a citation for who you think was an eyewitness to Jesus Christ, because we actually don't have any eyewitnesses to Jesus. We have Paul as our eyewitness, and he didn't really see Jesus while he was walking around on earth. He only experienced visions of Jesus after he supposedly died. Then I guess you could go to the Gospels, but those obviously weren't written by eyewitnesses. The disciples, they didn't even exist until the Gospels were invented, because Paul doesn't identify anybody as a disciple. He only identifies apostles. Apostles were those that received a vision of Jesus, which is what made them an apostle. So we literally have no eyewitnesses of Jesus. I'm kind of curious as to who you think is an eyewitness of Jesus. Let's see if Shaka God can tell us who these eyewitnesses are. He can't, because he's a dipshit.
It cannot be denied that even the enemies of Jesus Christ, some of them said they saw appearances of Jesus Christ. For example, Paul, who had written Romans.
Wait a second, Paul saw Jesus? I mean, he saw a vision of Jesus, which is different from actually seeing, like, Jesus walking on earth. A vision of Jesus is not seeing Jesus as he was living on earth. That's called a hallucination there, Shock of God. So Paul is not an eyewitness. Do you have any other eyewitnesses? What other enemies of Jesus saw Jesus, like, on earth? Or do you only have post-resurrection appearances? Because if you only have post-resurrection appearances, then those are not eyewitness accounts. You have people that had hallucinations.
So no one denies that they claim they saw appearances of Jesus Christ. We have to then ask ourselves, what is the most logical, rational explanation of these appearances?
Hallucinations. Those are the most rational and logical and reasonable explanations for appearances of a dead Jew.
So the case I'm going to give you right now is a cumulative case. There's more and more evidence that keeps adding on to this case. The next thing is the low status of women in that culture. Why is it that women's testimony was not as valid in that culture as it is today, yet in all the Gospels, it is the women, they are the first to arrive at the tomb because the men were scared.
Well, for one thing, it's not that the men were scared to go to the tomb. It's just that the women were the ones that were going to the tomb to anoint the body after it had been in the tomb. But also, you're completely wrong about the women's testimony in first century Judea and the Jewish culture in general. It's not that they distrusted women or anything like that. It was just seen as not socially acceptable for women to be in court. But that also doesn't mean that women couldn't be in court. It's well documented in historians like Josephus as well as others that women's testimony in court were accepted. It's just that it wasn't socially acceptable for women to generally appear in court. So women were trusted then, but let's just assume that he's correct and that women's testimony wasn't trusted. Well, that would also work with the major theme of the New Testament Gospels, and that's the idea of the least shall be first. It's all throughout the Gospels, this theme, and because of that fact, we would expect to see the least valued, a among the Jewish people to find the empty tomb or to find Jesus resurrected first, because the least shall be first. And that's all over the gospel. So it would actually be quite odd for men to find the tomb empty in this particular instance. So there are two ways in which your assertion here does not work. First, women's testimony was trusted, and you have no evidence to suggest that they weren't trusted, just that it was not socially acceptable for them to appear in court. Two, even if they weren't trusted, we would expect the Gospels to denote the women as being the ones to find the tomb empty first, because of the least shall be first theme.
So, any made-up story about the empty tomb of Jesus Christ and the women seeing the angels, any made-up story in that time surely would have used men. If you're trying to convince people in that culture, you would, if you're making up a story, you would use men.
No, actually, it would be quite odd for men to find the tomb first because of the theme of the least shall be first that's all throughout the Gospels. So you're wrong yet again.
Yet in all the Gospels, they're honest, and they show that the disciples, the male disciples, were scared, and it was the women that were the first to see the empty tomb. Now, when historians see embarrassment within a story, it's embarrassing that the male disciples were cowards. They feel that they've hit historical pay dirt, and that's what we see. This adds another level of credibility to it, that it is true, because any made-up story would have obviously used that the men were the first at the tomb, and also the level of embarrassment of the women being there adds credibility to the story. So the low status of women at that time, yet they're the first ones that arrive at the tomb, is another reason why I believe Jesus resurrected. It's a cumulative case.
Well, what he's regurgitating here is just the criterion of embarrassment, and it's primarily used in Christian apologetics, and that's because that's one of the only pieces of evidence that they have, and it's quite weak. The reason why it's weak is because he cannot know what is embarrassing to first century Jews. He's assuming that it would be embarrassing for women who had a low status in the society to find the tomb empty, but yet he disregards the entire notion of the least shall be first that is communicated in the Gospels. In fact, there are plenty of embarrassing stories that were made up from different religions, so his entire notion that they wouldn't make up embarrassing facts about their faith just falls apart. One really good example of this is the cult of Attis, who supposedly castrated himself before dying, and his followers also did that. Being castrated in the ancient world was definitely an insult, and they were definitely held in a lower status in the society. So why would they do this if Attis didn't actually cut his balls off? You know, now that I think of it, one of my favorite Jesus stories that is no longer extant to us today, but we know about it through other people writing about it, is this whole thing where Jesus takes Mary Magdalene up on a hill, and then he pulls a woman out of his side, out of his rib, and then he fucks her, and he comes inside of her, and then he reaches in and he pulls out his cum and he eats it. That seems quite embarrassing. That probably happened, right? Don't you think so, honey?
No.
What?
No.
Jesus ate cum. His own cum. That's important. His own cum.
Now, V is the voluntary suffering. It has been proven that people do not want to die for a lie if they know it's a lie. So the disciples believed that Jesus rose from the dead because they saw him. They all claim that they saw Jesus rise from the dead.
Well, so this has a few different ways to attack it, because one, the disciples were created with the Gospels, so there's no way to know whether or not Jesus actually had disciples, if he even existed in history. Paul never denotes anybody as being a disciple or seeing Jesus while he was alive walking around. So for all intents and purposes, the disciples were completely invented with the Gospels. So this brings into question who was dying for a lie in this particular instance. If the disciples didn't exist for as far as we know, who was dying for a lie? The answer is nobody was dying for a lie. Everybody that was being persecuted as a Christian was already deeply in the faith and had no reason to doubt whether or not their faith was historical. So these people wouldn't be dying for a lie, they would be dying for their faith, which they truly believed in.
In bodily form, not a ghost or a spirit, but in an actual physical body.
Listen, just because Jesus' ghost was a corporeal form doesn't mean that he was in some way not spiritual. He was definitely a spiritual or celestial figure. Just because that celestial figure had a flesh and blood body does not mean that he wasn't some kind of ghost or apparition or celestial being. I think that celestial being is probably the best term to use for Jesus after he supposedly resurrected. Because celestial beings have flesh and blood bodies, but they can also disappear like goddamn Batman, like Jesus did on that one road when he was talking to those two clueless fucks. He pretty much revealed himself and then was like, justice, and then disappeared. So, I mean, you really don't have anybody that saw Jesus walking around even as a corporeal celestial figure.
So people will not die for a lie if they know it's a lie. For example, the 9/11 hijackers, they went ahead and they murdered people because they were brainwashed by their Muslim teachers, and they really believe, no one denies that the 9/11 hijackers really believe in what they were taught. So we got to ask ourselves, why did the 911 hijackers fly into the plane? Because they believed what they were taught. Okay.
Right. And this directly correlates to the Christians that were being persecuted and dying for their faith, with the exception that they weren't willfully flying planes in the first century Judea or the first century world. They weren't, suicide bombing any kind of cafes on the corners of Israel streets, but they were holding on to their faith regardless of whether or not they would die. And they had no knowledge as to whether or not it was historical because they just had their faith, just like you have your faith. And also, I would definitely die for a lie. Let's just say that some, Ruskies started to take over the South for whatever fucking reason, and I hid my son in the attic. And some of the Ruskies came to my house and was like, "Where's your son?" And I would be like, "I don't have a son. What the fuck are you talking about?" And, I would lie to protect my son. My point is that people will die for a lie. It just depends on what the lie is and what their motives are for holding to that lie. But in case I wasn't explicit enough, the people that started Christianity, that started this fringe cult in the first century, are a completely different set of people than those that were being persecuted later on.
Why did the disciples, they were willing to die for Jesus Christ? They didn't kill, but they're willing to die for Jesus Christ when the sword was at their neck, and all they had to do was deny that he was risen from the dead. This is different than the 9/11 hijackers. The 9/11 hijackers never saw Jesus raised from the dead, but the witnesses to Jesus' resurrection were willing to die for that truth because they saw it. 9/11 hijackers never saw Muhammad. The disciples saw Jesus rise from the dead. So,
well, my guess is that you would definitely die for your faith, since the first Christians that were dying for their faith are in a similar boat as you are. My guess is that they didn't have to see Jesus resurrect in order to die for their faith that they truly believed in, just like the 9/11 hijackers that strictly believed in their faith and thought that they would go to heaven. Now, you think that your faith is correct. They think that their faith is correct. And you have reasons, unbeknownst to me or anybody else in this world, as to why you think that your faith is more true than Islam. And you're not actually going to explain why it's more true, but you think that it's more true anyways. So I really don't see a big difference between you and your faith and a Muslim and their faith. You both believe in it wholeheartedly, and you both would most likely die for your faith. This is representative of anybody that was dying or was being persecuted for being a Christian.
You got to ask, why were they willing to be voluntarily suffered and killed for the fact that Jesus rose from the dead? And then we have also the empty tomb. That's another reason why I believe that Jesus resurrected.
Wait a second, didn't we already cover the empty tomb? Or are we coming over some other kind of different aspect of the empty tomb? Like, I kind of feel like we've already covered this shit.
The enemies of Jesus Christ in Scripture even admit that the tomb was empty. The excuse that the Jews were using, because everyone was saying that Jesus was risen from the dead and the tomb was empty, they never denied the tomb was empty. They said, well, the disciples stole the body. But that's a weak argument, because it's not like Weekend at Bernie's where the disciples have a dead corpse and they're propping it up. They're actually saying that Jesus was eating food in front of them, that he was speaking to them.
Okay, guys, really awesome. Honey, I got a really awesome idea. It's for a movie. It's Weekend at Bernie's, but Jesus Christ in the first century. It makes sense. I think we can make this happen. We need to start a petition online. Weekend at Bernie's Jesus. Weekend at Bernie's 3.
I know who's going to play Jesus.
Who's going to play Jesus?
Jimmy Snow.
Jimmy Snow. Jimmy Snow would make a good Jesus. I think that would be an awesome movie. Yes, we're going to make this happen. But also, this particular apologetic about the disciples stealing the body from the tomb, and that's why the tomb's empty, was something that arose because of the Gospel of Mark being written, and because of Christians that were saying that exact same thing, that the tomb was found empty. And so people started saying, well, you know, that's because the disciples stole it. So this is actually the oldest apologetic against the empty tomb claim of Christianity. Now, I don't think it's a particularly strong argument, because the Romans would have definitely made a big kerfluffle, and it would definitely have been noted that they went around and they killed a whole bunch of people because they supposedly stole a body from a tomb of a convicted criminal that died as a result of execution. So I don't think that it's all that particularly strong, but you also have to keep in mind that this apologetic didn't come around until the mid-80s at least, because that is when the Gospel of Matthew would have been written. That is the only place where this particular apologetic actually crops up. So, wrong again there, motorcycle boy.
There's definitely a reason why the tomb was empty. The disciples are claiming that Jesus had risen from the dead. So I just went through 5 reasons right there, cumulative reasons, that are rational for a Christian to believe that Jesus raised from the dead.
Well, those were his 5 reasons that you guys should become a Christian. They were not new, they were not exciting, they were not scientific, they weren't anything that could resemble actual evidence that Jesus resurrected from the dead and that we should all be a Christian. This is the same apologetic shit that he's been spinning for 11 or more years. Honey, if I ever believe in dumb shit for these dumb reasons, could you like put me in a home or something?
Yep.
Okay, thank you. Well, heathens, I hope that you liked this video today. If you did, go down below, let me know in the comments section. I'd love to hear what you thought about Shock of God's reasons for becoming a Christian. Hey, while you're down there, why don't you smash that like button and subscribe if you like this kind of content. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice. Bye, heathens.